Hello everyone, my name is Dr Dima El Sharkawi. I'm a haematologist that works at the Royal Marsden Hospital in London in the UK. I'm not in London at the moment, I'm in Milan. It's very hot, but I'm here for the European Haemotology Congress. It's the 30th Congress, and there were a few abstracts that were discussed at this meeting on Waldentstroms that I want to share with you all. So when we come to these conferences, there's a mixture of things that are presented either as big lectures in the lecture halls or as posters. So it's a good opportunity for us to see the latest data and also interact with our colleagues as well. So in terms of data with drugs that perhaps are newer drugs or drugs that might come onto the market in the near future, there were a number of drugs that were being discussed at this year's EHA. So when we look at the drugs that we use to treat WM, I think of things that treat proteins that are on the surface or attack proteins that are on the surface of the WM cells, or things that target the enzymes that work within the cells to keep the cells alive and propagating. So the drugs that were discussed at this year's meeting were mainly focusing on different enzymes that work within the cell to keep the cells alive and to keep them expanding and growing. So if you can target those enzymes and stop those enzymes from working, then the cells die and then we get a reduction in the WM. And there's two main enzymes that we are most interested in, or that the drugs that are available or near available target. So there's one enzyme called BCL2. So there are a couple of BCL2 inhibitors that have been discussed at this year, and how WM responds to those BCL2 inhibitors. So one is venetoclax. So there was a poster from one of the US groups looking at their experience with about 30 patients who've been on long-term venetoclax, and showing that this venetoclax that targets BCL2, the majority of people who took it, their WM responded and it reduced in size. But not only did you get a good response in terms of depth of response and how much reduction in the level of WM that is being produced, that these responses are durable, so that they last a long time. So well over a year for many patients, which is very encouraging. That's one drug that targets BCL2. There is another drug that's earlier in its development that targets the same enzyme called sonrotoclax. So when drugs are first developed, they go through different phases of clinical trial. So the first phase is a phase 1 study, where the focus and the main aim from the drug company's perspective is to look at what's the best dose to give patients and what the safety profile is, so what kind of side effects patients are experiencing when they take these drugs. So there was a poster looking at the phase 1 experience of sonrotoclax in patients with WM and some of the longer term outcomes with that. So once again, there's been a number of patients that have taken sonrotoclax. It's a tablet that people can take for as long as their disease is responding. And like we've seen with the data from venetoclax, the majority of patients respond, and that response can last for a long time. So I'm really excited to see how this drug gets developed, and hopefully it will then be able to get a license so that we can use it in everyday practice for our patients with WM. That's BCL2 inhibitors. The next enzyme that is of interest that many of you will already be aware about is BTK. So many of you already know about BTK because you may already be on BTK inhibitors such as ibrutinib or zanubrutinib as examples. But we know eventually those drugs work very well, but eventually the WM finds ways of becoming resistant to those drugs. And so now there are newer drugs that target BTK in a different way. And one newer class of drugs are what we call BTK degraders. So they don't just bind to the enzyme and stop it working, but they actually cause the enzyme to be destroyed or disintegrate, if you like. And that can add added benefit because we think that the BTK not only works as an enzyme to catalyze different reactions, but it acts as a scaffolding for other reactions to occur. So if you remove it completely, then you're not providing that scaffolding for other reactions to occur in the cell. So there were 2 different BTK degraders that are being presented at this year's Congress, both of which about 20 to 30 patients with WM have already had them as part of these early phase clinical trials. And once again, we're seeing about over 80% of patients with WM responding to these BTK degraders. The side effect profile seems to be manageable. So some patients get some low blood counts with it, some can get bruising, and some get gastrointestinal side effects such as diarrhea, but generally these are quite mild side effects. And it's still early days, but the response so far is encouraging, and there are some patients who started at the beginning of the trial that have been on these drugs for over a year, and their disease is still responding. So once again, a really exciting area that I'm looking forward to hearing how these drugs develop over the next few years, and hopefully they will become available soon for patients with WM across the world. The final thing that I wanted to discuss was one really interesting meeting or presentation that I was at a couple of days ago here, which was combining the clinicians with the regulatory authorities, with pharma companies, and with patients. And it was looking at really how can we collaborate as a group. Now, I think the IWMF already do a really, really good job of bringing all the different people together, bringing the patients together with the doctors. And it's really important that you as patients get involved, I think, in helping us design all these trials, because it's important to know what's important for you, which may be slightly different than what we think is important. So it was a really interesting discussion there about how patients should be really involved from the beginning and how they can really help shape trials to get the relevant outcomes at the end, but also how we should be looking at what we should be assessing as what's a good result. What do we want from these newer drugs? Because it's not just about how much we reduce the level of disease. We want to know that patients are feeling better, that they're managing to get back to their everyday life and not being burdened either by the symptoms of WM or side effects from the drug. So it's a really interesting topic to hear. So hopefully I'll be able to talk to you again in future years about some of the updates from these trials. Thanks for listening.